maybe we start with the fact that you were in the United States, Northwestern University.
Yes, in Chicago.
For a teaching gig when Donald Trump was being elected.
2019, Joe Biden announced his candidacy not too far from where I was, in Boston. I was attached to Harvard University at the time. And, he went to a fire station, and that's where, to symbolize his working class, affinities. And I saw those elections when he defeated Trump. I, this time around, saw the reverse of it, being in Chicago at Northwestern, as you've correctly pointed out, in the Department of Politics and African Studies. And I taught in the Department of Politics, which, would come back to your point about the discourse that unfolded in the course of the elections. But there was something else that was happening in the US whilst I was there in 2019 and now. It is that I saw the American society, particularly the Black American society, at moments when it mourned, the passing of its most iconic cultural, practitioners. So, in 2019, that famous, scholar who gave us the book, The Bluest Eye, and what's the other book? I'll remember the name just now. Had just died. Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison had just died, and this time around, Nikki Giovanni, had just passed, in fact, passed whilst I was there. Now, these are two. Remember, one received the Nobel Peace Prize in Literature. One considered herself, a ghetto poet. And they were very key to preserving the Black American, history. And so I saw the American society, the Black American society mourn. Maybe mourn is not quite the right word, but go through the process of losing some of the very key people who were central to maintaining the memory of the Black American slave. And those years coincided. The passing of, Toni Morrison, the passing of Nikki Giovanni coincides with elections, in both ends. So I was, as you said, in the US, and I saw the elections. I saw the campaign. A whole, almost a year, then a couple of months campaign leading up to the election of Donald Trump. I was teaching political science. In fact, I taught a course, to third-year students, which we titled Theories of Modernity. But it was about politics, basically, and increasingly, as the campaign unfolded, it became difficult in class to say certain things. Not because one was not able to say them or capable of saying them, but I hadn't gone to the US, to attract unnecessary attention, and not that I feared what would happen, but I hadn't gone to attract unnecessary attention. But I also saw how the political space for debate in the university was closing because we had a Black professor of journalism, at Northwestern who was expelled, for supporting the Palestinian encampments, in my campus. And by the way, if you were South African, you would laugh at those protests. People erect tents, they have water and food, they are sitting there, not a single class breaks. Nothing, you walk past them, you go to class, they would never disturb class, they just sit there on the lawns, it's nothing really that approximates a protest as we know it. So we had a colleague in journalism, a Black American professor of journalism, who was expelled for supporting that encampment. In history, we had, a professor of North African history, particularly Egyptian history, who was asked, because many of the students who organized, the encampments were from her course, they were from Egypt, and somehow many of them wanted to understand that part of the world, gravitated to her cause. So it appeared she supported the protest, and as it is a right for everyone to, but she was then charged for instigating, the protest, and was asked to submit her phone, in order that the university may check if, she had been, deliberately instigating. So the political space for debate was closing, gradually. That was within, so these examples are within the university, but there was also a larger debate in the public society that reflected an even more aggressive closure or contraction of, the space for debate. The universities somehow still had to try and maintain a pretense that they were open, but, in the open public, there were no inhibitions. And so there, the political space, for public debate was closing much faster. Trump came to, a state not too far from Chicago, where I was, Ohio. And Ohio has had a large number of immigrants from Haiti. We know the history of Haiti and the relationship with America. Has had a large number of immigrants from Haiti, and went to Ohio basically to sympathize with white voters in Haiti who were complaining that these Black people were actually eating their dogs and their cats, their pets. And it sounds bizarre, but the truth is that the stadium was full, and you had old people, volunteering stories of how my cat disappeared, and I heard that it was, slaughtered down the road by Black people, and another one said my dog disappeared. So if you had a public discourse along those lines in the 21st century, and there was nothing wrong, society found nothing wrong, because I think that what we must point out is that this is not a Trump thing in America. This is a resurgence of whiteness, basically, of white racism, coming back, aggressively to the fold. So you had those kinds of discourses, and one wondered really what was left, what could not be said about us as Black people. If we were back into, you remember the Enlightenment philosophers who said all sorts of things about us, the Hegels, the Kants, and all of those guys. It was as though they were having a second coming, if we were eating dogs and cats. And lo and behold, there was never in the public discourse where Trump, there were sections of the press, true, that disagreed and rebuked him, but there was never really a downpour, basically, of outrage that would lead to him, for instance, retracting such statements. So the counter was basically absent to that kind of discourse. And, there were several other things I could go on that would make it obvious to one that he did make a point that I thought was a jest, but it was also a statement on us as Africans. When he said we must all go back home, the immigrants, and some other people were saying, but, we bring skills, we bring expertise. He said, if you are educated and you are skilled, your countries need you. It was a double-edged statement. It was a double-edged sword. The truth is true. Our countries, the continent needs us. Why are we, but I don't think that's what we want to discuss now. But I think at some point we must reflect on the double-edged nature of that statement, So at that point, I realized that it would be very difficult for me as a student of politics and a professor of politics, in a university in America to sustain my, engagement with students and public engagements generally. And so when the results came, I had a 2-year contract. I then decided that, no, maybe it was better to go. Maybe Trump was right, that if we're educated, our countries need us.
I see.
And I decided, to return. As a result of that, I couldn't take on my second year of appointment.
Hi. But you've had also a very direct interaction with the Venezuelan people, Venezuela itself, in light then of what looks like one of the most dramatic single-handed acts, in relation to Gaddafi. There was African participation.
Yeah.
There was a participation of international forums. But the United States woke up in the morning and went to take Maduro and his wife on the basis that they are narco-terrorists inside their country. Your reading of that moment, on the one hand, but also tell us on the other, your own journey and interaction, the story of your interaction with the question of Venezuela.
So, 2017, 2017 or 18, thereabout, Maduro had ascended to power following the unfortunate passing of Hugo Chavez, Comandante Hugo Chavez. And about 2-3 years into his rule, Maduro was under siege, particularly from Western Marxists, based in America and in Europe, who were beginning to denounce him, as not a Marxist, or basically casting dubitability on his Marxist credentials. And somewhat comparing him to Hugo Chavez, Comandante Hugo Chavez, and, Fidel Castro. And unfortunately, whether they had ideological, reasons for this, barrage from Marxist, white Marxists, and we must be specific, it was from white Marxists, coincided with America's, counter offensive against, Venezuela. You would remember that America has done what it did to Maduro before, to Hugo Chavez,
Yes.
but did not succeed, because the people rose and they had to return him, and this barrage by white Marxists coincided with America's, and there was legitimate fear within, the political circles in Venezuela that there might be, a confluence of these leading to America doing exactly what it had done to Comandante Hugo Chavez, which was to abduct him. And so Venezuelans realized that part of what was missing in the analysis of the white Marxists was the fact that they were so overly concerned with the conditions of living in Venezuela simply on the basis of class analysis. What their analysis led was 2 things: race and colonialism. And so I got an invitation, from, the government of Maduro in 2017, 2018, to visit, to visit Venezuela and travel the country and have a conversation with the people in Venezuela about the experience of being colonized and of being racially, dominated. Because what was missing, in the whole discourse at that time was basically the history of slavery, the history of colonialism, and the history of racial domination. And so we were speaking back, we were invited by the Venezuelans, to speak back to the white Marxists who were speaking right from the heart of the metropole that had been responsible for colonialism, and they somewhat had developed an amnesia about the fact that their own societies, and they were saying nothing about their own societies, casting aspersion on Maduro. And odd enough, some of these critiques came from within America, some Marxists from within America, who forgot that a large part of the destabilization of Venezuela was actually America. So this very insular Marxist analysis allowed them to be ignorant of race and racism, to be ignorant of colonialism, and to be ignorant of slavery. So I was invited, to spend some time. I think I spent a month and some weeks in Venezuela, traveling the country, having a conversation with, different people on TV, visiting the barrios, so it was not the typical, elite visits that you see today when people visit. I was taken to the rural areas, slept in the barrios. The barrios are the equivalent of Mjondol. I stayed there. There was never five-star treatment. I lived with the people, and it was my fortune whilst there to visit the grave of Comandante Chavez and developed a strong bond with the people of Venezuela. We had from a distance admired the revolution that, Comandante Chavez had instigated. But now I got to study closely the history of that revolution and that society. And since then, I've maintained a very strong bond with the people of, Venezuela, the progressive forces, in Venezuela. And I may digress and tell you what I saw in Venezuela, because I'm a student of society, so wherever I go, I study society. They had, when Comandante Chavez took over, had said, we have always complained about, the colonial nature of universities. Let us then have an alternative, structure of a university. So they have something called UNEARTE, which is an experimental university of the arts. So they experiment about everything, the structure of the disciplines, and everything, and it allows them to break away or break out of the disciplinary boundaries, humanities, political science, and this, I didn't have the time. I did give a few talks at UNEARTE, but I didn't have the time to study closely the model. But it fascinated me because there was nothing set in stone. It was an experimental university. If we found that this didn't work this year, next year we changed it. And they said, until we are able to settle to a model that is an alternative. That's what decolonization means in real sense. Not the people who patronize, they talk about decolonization and they are not ready, to take such, what here would be called risky steps. There was nothing risky about UNEARTE. It was a fantastic university. It still exists. And it trains people in various ways. But to return to what has happened in the recent past. Now, within the American officialdom, there is a part of the Pentagon that does what is called war gaming. Now, war gaming basically is a discipline where people, different experts, gather to explore from different positions. So you would sit around the table. You are against the abduction of Maduro. I'm for the abduction of Maduro. This one is looking at stands for Latin America. So we would have gone away for 6 months and we had been experts in the area, would have gone away, visited the countries and said, I have come from Latin America. This is the mood within Latin America. If you did that, this is what is going to happen. And then the other person who says who's for this, it doesn't matter. If we go the realist way, they can't beat us militarily. And then the other person. So you may have about 15 people who look at, the different, and they're experts. These are not chance takers. These are people who've been engaged with, different aspects. Some of them are economists. What would happen economically? Some of them oil trade. What would happen to. So we know that the abduction of Maduro was not discussed this time around for the first time. It had been discussed before. There had been a session on wargaming, when, in fact, twice before, when Obama was still in charge and then when Biden was in charge. And on both occasions, it would seem that those who argued against it won, and this time around, even those who were engaged in the previous experiments, wargaming, were a bit surprised that it had happened. Because they say if that had happened, if that wargaming had happened in this instance, they don't see the facts supporting, that action. Which means that we are in a somewhat different era of politics, spearheaded by Trump. It is that students of politics who sit and extrapolate on the basis of reason, on the basis of propositions, argumentation and deductions, we've long left that era behind. So when you then sit and try and make sense on the basis of such extrapolations based on objective rational argumentations, you are likely to miss basically what Trump is all about. Racism, remember, thinks of itself when European man becomes man God, it is what I want as man God. Everything else has to adapt to what I want. Trump represents the resurgence of the European man and, Western racism basically putting white people's interest at the forefront. Every other thing would have to follow suit. So if you start from, why would it do that? It's undemocratic. Laws of international law does not permit, the white man doesn't care. He's the law. He's God, and so you are going to expend a lot of energy trying to, make sense on the basis of reason and rationality, as to what is happening. Racism has never been rational. It's never founded on reason. In fact, reason had to be in its service, Now, the abduction of Maduro, I know the regime closely because I visited and I continue to visit Venezuela. We can blame Maduro for everything else, but socialist regimes have never really been drug dealers. Socialist regimes have always prided themselves with a certain moral superiority. He may be guilty of other things, but certainly not drugs. Not drugs.
But why are Americans buying the drugs?
Why are they buying the drugs?
Yeah, I mean, the argument of drugs makes no sense.
Yes.
I want to propel you back. Something about the discourse on decolonization. I am not part of the academy. You know that I've had my share of it, but something about that I want to, for a moment, maybe as a way to come back to the continent.
Yeah.
In recent conversations, maybe there are ways of finding in the past where there may be connections, but I fear that often the African remains in the discourse of decolonizations, at least in these recent canvassed versions of it, as this figure whose form of knowledge must be outside of structure.
Okay.
Outside of of structure. It seems to be the rejection in the main of the scientific proposition.
Okay.
That the African is this figure who must be released from science so that they can rely on spirits, and on the one hand, but secondly, they can rely on improvise.
Okay.
They have this capacity of, it's not transcendence, but in the colloquial sense.
Yeah.
It's not Kantian transcendental element, but in the African must rely on the spirit, must be allowed to go and rely on the spirit as a form of constituting a province of knowledge about the world, about themselves, and all of that. They must improvise.
Yeah.
And I find that it has produced quite mediocre, and you'll tell me, obviously, I mean, quite mediocre since it premises itself on the rejection of the science, so that then it produces very mediocre responses to understandings of the world, our understandings of the African question itself, or the African condition. I don't want to go to my references, but I mean, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about.
Exactly, yeah.
Which I'd like to invite you then to give us your thoughts on the relationship between decolonization and science. What should it be?
So it's a pretty involved question. I'm hoping that the time we have would be enough so that we're able to explicate it, in a manner adequate to the complexity. Let's first agree with you. The scholarship on decolonization is very mediocre in South Africa today. In fact, I would go further than you and say that it is now used, for career advancement. So people who write about decolonization, sometimes decoloniality. In fact, they mostly prefer the language of decoloniality. It is nothing but a ruse, for upward mobility within the cadres. It's a scholarship that, basically mimics, or repeats the same old methods of, according to Walter Mignolo, decolonization is this. According to Maldonado Torres, it is this. It is not in any way embedded in the lived experience of the Black colonized that people are talking about. In fact, you can see the distance between the people who write, who make Black people who are colonized. They make them objects, of their study. Whereas they are saying they want to decolonize, and one of the things they want to do in decolonizing is to breach the subject-object Cartesian distinction. But when you look at their writings, they still reproduce the Black colonized as basically the objects of their study. So I'm just going beyond the fact that, there's nothing really. There is, as a body of thought, there are individual good works here and there. They are too far between, so that we don't get into trouble. I won't mention those good, but there's good scholarship in between. But as a body of thought, as a recognizable body of thought, basically decoloniality in South Africa is a ruse. It's in the language of young people, it's a scam. It's a scam. Now let us get back to the question that we are asking, which is, what is the relationship between decolonization and science?
This is it seems to me a very important question.
It is.
Because epistemically,
Yeah.
After we have to actually begin with what are we doing about the fact of having to know.
Yes.
When we say we are decolonizing, that we have to know ourselves, our history, that we have to produce out of this knowledge solutions to the water problem, to the bread problem, to artistic creativity, to beauty, to love.
Yes.
But the initial a priori qualification, or rather question of what it is to know. And I mean, the West's answer is science.
Yeah.
It seems, or at least the West says that this science is theirs. But I mean, I'm sure we all know that's another lie. But what is the relationship between decolonization and science? Because, Jesus, are these chaps even scientists?
Which ones?
The ones who are doing decolonization.
No, but so that the question is not lost, because it's a fundamental question, so that the seriousness of the question is not lost to subtlety. Let us contextualize it. So the coming out of Europe into the extra-European world of what you call modern science was not just the coming of modern science as what does it mean to know, what are the basis of verification, what is objective truth. That aspect, of the export from Europe, or import, from Europe into, Africa and the extra-European world, was the coming of what we call the modern meaning totality. Now, what is the modern meaning totality? It is science and more. It is that the advent of modernity in Europe from the 16th century onwards, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, the Cartesian Revolution, the Copernican Revolution, and religious reform or Lutheran reform. As a result of these four, processes, basically there was a transformation or a transition of society from, in Europe, what was the medieval society, to the modern society. And that transition created what is called what I call a modern meaning totality, which is the way of being in the world. It's a way of thinking. I call it the modern meaning totality because it is like carpet, a wall-to-wall carpet. It suches everything. It leaves nothing unattended. It transforms meaning, of anything. You would know as well as I do that the meaning, for instance, of pleasure changed as a result of modernity. We now think of tragedy. We now think of, all sorts of things. Sorrow, the meaning of sorrow changed. Even how we feel changed.
Even boredom.
Assumed a different meaning. Alcohol was not always a source of pleasure. It is as a result of this transition, from the medieval period to the modern meaning totality. Now, science, as it emerges in Europe, is encapsulated in large part by two of those four processes that we mentioned. It is the Copernican Revolution and the Cartesian Revolution.
Fair enough.
So there is...
I don't know why you would exclude industry there, but it's okay. I'm with you for now.
Okay. So these two encapsulate basically, let's call it the refinement of Western science into disciplinary knowledges. Because, there's never always been chemistry, physics, and whatnot, and whatnot. How do these things arise? Because of that transition, industrialization leads to urbanization of society. new social exigencies arise and there has to be a response. Populations are cramped in the cities. The factories have emerged as a result of industrialization. Social housing becomes an issue. Public health becomes an issue. And so disciplines emerge, all modern disciplinary knowledges, all of them, without exception, as we know them today, as they are taught in the university, as they represent science, they emerge as a response to the exigencies thrown up by industrialization. And so they are attached to the logic of capital. And so when you talk about science in the Western sense, remember I said this is a modern meaning totality, it's wall to wall. When you accept science, or when you accept the Copernican revolution and the Cartesian revolution, you've also accepted other things. Invariably, you've also accepted the generalization of Judeo-Christian values in society. That's why we study the Protestant ethic, for instance, in sociology by Weber, who tells us that societies with a Protestant ethic tend to do better economically. And it's held to be, a proposition worth debating in science. Because there is a generalization of Judeo-Christian values. So the acceptance of modern science is also an acceptance of these other generalizations that emerge from religion, particularly Judeo-Christian religion. What I'm trying to drive at is that you may be onto a point, but the way you articulate it misses it, which is that the protestation against science as it has emerged out of Europe's transition into the modern period is an acceptance of the modern Western meaning totality. And there is a problem then with that, because the ethic of that knowledge is an ethic of domination. Remember how that knowledge comes to us. It is via colonialism. Two, remember that knowledge comes to us on the back of capital. So there's a close relationship between capitalism and, this knowledge, because it's in service, of capitalism. So what do you see as a pushback? Sometimes it's a pushback that is inarticulate because it is an acceptance of science that basically tethers us onto capitalism. But because people haven't studied this, they pretend to have understood it. They aren't able to articulate it. So once you accept modern science as formulated by the West as objective rational knowledge, you also have accepted the logic of capitalism. Now, this modern meaning totality that imposes itself on us via colonialism and violence today continues to perpetuate itself through violence, but it may not be physical violence. Remember, violence does not only have to be material and physical, it's also symbolic. So what people are protesting again is what they don't understand. How is it that we're tethered into this modern meaning totality in the name of science? They can't see, they look around, but it is symbolic violence. And what is symbolic violence? You must go to school, study this science, and society will reward you with a job. And then it would attach to you a definition of success you were not party to. And then you are going to be termed successful when you were not there when success was being defined. So what people are pushing against, what you hear is an inarticulate analysis of what is the problem with modern science. That it is tethered, or it tethers us into the Western modern meaning totality. Now, there are other meaning totalities that have existed in the extra-European world. But the dominant ethic of the Western modern meaning totality expresses itself in this way. You see, this Western form of science that we are talking about is very intolerant. It does not allow other forms of knowledge to coexist with it. If you want to suggest, other forms of knowing and other modes of being in the world, this modern meaning totality says, come and justify them to me. You say you have ancestors. What is that? How do you know that they exist? It has already set the standard of proof for you, empirical validation. So it sets itself as the standard on the basis of which every other truth is to be measured. That is the problem then with this notion of science. It is its dominant ethic. It is its inability to coexist with, with other forms of truth. Lyotard, a French scholar, has an interesting article titled "What is Postmodernity?" and says that, since the era of modernity, the scientist has also arrogated unto himself or herself the responsibility of being a judge as to what is just and what is not just. And he says that's not a scientific determination. We say today, on the basis of that modern science, what is just and what is not just. The problem is that this modern meaning totality is also a judge. First says, come to justify, it's the standard, but it's also the judge. So you can pass the test of having knowledge as extra-European people only on the basis of its own, standard. Now, here's the part where I agree with you. It is that because of a lack of understanding, people then say, we must do away with this modern Western, meaning totality, and postulate all sorts of things as being evidence of African forms of knowledge. There is African form of knowledge. There's African epistemology. But they haven't studied it, closely. So they postulate all sorts of things. The result is that because they haven't studied this Western modern meaning totality and mastered it, because unlike Europeans, extra-European societies don't have the luxury of being ignorant of the modern meaning totality because it has generalized itself all over the world. For us to get to anything else, our path will have to go through the Western modern meaning totality. We would have to understand it in order to get out of it. That's why Marx studied liberal economists before he could postulate an alternative. We don't have the luxury to be ignorant of it. They have the luxury to be ignorant of us. Because their knowledge has been extended to the extra-European world, we have to be aware of it. Now, that's where the discourse on decoloniality falls short, because there is a refusal that I think is coupled with laziness, to fully understand this modern Western meaning totality. To study it doesn't mean then that you can out of it develop original thought. Bigo read Hegel. Bigo read several other Sartre and several other Western scholars, but he gave us original thought that is peculiarly South African. People come from all over the world to come and study it. Originality does not mean refusing influences, that have come from outside. So the point I'm making is that the search for the alternative has unfortunately moved from a wrong premise because of an inability to understand fully the affliction that we've gone through as a result of the modern Western meaning totality that has embedded in it an ethic of domination.
I have several nodal points of differences, but I do think let's as long as we agree that to the extent to which the project must be pursued, it must always already be committed to knowledge. Like that is important for me because I think there's when you are decolonial, in a sense, you sound like you are winging, you are composing as you go, you are as an essence non-structural. And I think that falls into a form where, for instance, those who must govern,
Yeah.
for instance, who must predict
Yeah.
the floods and plan for the floods as a matter of governmental rationality.
Yes.
You get what I mean? And those who must say, for instance, there is a budget, we're planning to take children to school every day.
Okay.
So the children are 100. They are traveling over this type of a distance. It's going to need 1,000 rand over the next 365 days. That money is there. We ring-fence it, and we give it to these chaps of transport. They sign that they are paid. They must transport kids 365 days. That's proper. We don't retreat, because then you wake up in the morning, 80,000 children in Gauteng are not going to school for 2 months.
I have to interject. I do.
Where do those terrains of because look at the form or the state of the state.
Yeah.
The state of, maybe when I say the state of the state, you think I'm speaking about a very universal concept. I'm just how public management is occurring in South Africa, in the local state, in the national state, with public institutions, with the rest of the continent.
Mm.
If I'm in this decolonization, which obviously you've dismissed as it has signs of laziness, of not understanding sometimes that which it critiques.
Yeah.
The scholars, where are they? Like, that's why, in my view, it's that disconnect. The academic, professorial, public intellectual will not be able to tell you what's wrong with those Africans, will not be able to get the kids a bridge to a school over a river, or who are not giving kids toilets in a school and all of that. Then you are having a situation where there is a complete disconnect. People are talking about decolonization everywhere, but they're not able to scientifically, or whatever the case of the label of knowledge it is that comes as a residue after decolonization, explain to us the acts and the behaviors, the phenomena of the post-colonial state, the phenomena of Ket Matlala, of you don't. The discourse sort of falls short to explain ourselves to ourselves.
So you've raised quite a number of very, very agent points that are to be discussed. Maybe one is, so when people go to the university to study science, anywhere in the world today, because of this modern meaning totality, they are told that the purpose of science is to explain, to predict, and to control. That's the purpose of science. If you study science deeply, it has those three purposes, because once you are able to explain, you are able to predict. If I can explain our behavior here, then I can predict, and if I can predict, I can control. Now that's what is considered to be at the core of modern science. Now, if you look closely at these three-dimensional elements of science, explain, predict, and control, they already exude power. They already exude a sense of power, because he who can explain can predict, and then of course can control. Controlling who? Now it takes us back to the association of modern knowledge, or what you call science, with power. what do you call the state, the government rationality, is one such instrument of the expression of that power. What decolonization, I think, is concerned about are more fundamental questions that sit behind that rationality, that government rationality.
Mm-hmm.
Who is considered human and who is not considered human, such that the very people we are talking about who don't give black kids transport to school, if those were white kids, they'll give them transport to school. So it's not a pragmatic question. It's a philosophical, fundamental, a priori question. Who's human? And how did that category human was arrived at? And how was it determined what kind of treatment is fit for this category of human beings and is fit for this category whose humanity is debatable?
Mm-hmm.
Because if we run to the pragmatic of the state, we are actually going to wreck, along a branch from precisely what we want to escape from.
Let me ask you differently.
Yeah.
Africans have a peculiar, nonetheless not unique, position of colonization.
Okay.
There are peoples of the world that are not African that have had this experience. And then there's this transatlantic black hole of, I think that almost in the colonial global movement, what happened in the transatlantic attributed a specific sign, a mark to the body that is African, which maybe a Chinese, an Indian may not quite fully appreciate. But nonetheless, here is a people dispossessed of their humanity. China, Vietnam, India, the East Asian people, as it were. It seems to me that in this proposition you are making about, for instance, whose humanity, something must have happened or should happen here in the production of scientists or of scholars.
I prefer scholars,
of scholars, in the production of social science practitioners, lawyers, accountants, engineers that are being produced to partake in the management of the life of the affairs in the terrain that you call the pragmatic. A sense of commitment, of fidelity. That, for instance, a despot in Singapore, in Malaysia, would have that, okay, that's fine. There's this Malaysian question, which is colonization, slavery, ultimate abandonment even on Asian values. And then there's a commitment
to
this production of these individuals who, will do that. I'm saying in the end, decolonization as a, what do you call it? What would we call it as a movement? If I not dismissed it, but not as a replacement of one species with another, but as a recreation of human beings who got a fidelity
to themselves and to those who look like them.
To the school kids, to the to the hospital, to Tembisa Hospital, that somebody would have allowed 2 billion rands to be looted completely on the everyday basis through invoices that are just 350,400 for every day for 2 years until it was over 2 billion to organized criminals. I'm saying that at some point, we need to produce people that are different.
True.
And I wonder you are able to say, with the status of decolonial studies at the moment, such a production, firstly, can understand and diagnose the problems, but secondly, will be able to produce this revolutionary public servant, intellectual person.
So I think what you are doing is to burden the discourse of decolonization with a task that is partly its own. So the discourse of decolonization, cum a movement on decolonization here, has to be both a cause and an effect. It has to produce these academics, but it itself needs to be instigated by a state that is committed to decolonization.
It could be a counter-cultural cause. It could be, for instance, a revolution, like when Fidel and them constitute the July 26th movement. It is within a state that is already independent, and they are reading Batista, and they are rejecting injustice, which is being enacted by a certain post-colonial potentate.
So here is what...
as a counterculture, so to speak, to use those terms
cultural
of
studies like...
but mostly Gramsci, the concept of counterculture. Revolution as the countercultural commitment to the propositions of oppression. At the center of which it lies. It's a lie, this thing that, for instance, blacks are inferior. It's just a lie that was, and I was reading Tio Soga's
hymns
letter, a public article, 1836, that he wrote in reply to some white priests saying Africans are helpless. In about a century, they won't exist. He says, but I see Africans existing every extinction, socially engineered by human beings. And he counts the events, Tio Soga. Says, I think they'll still be here. He says, because in the main, all these extinctions, they carry a lie and enact violence.
Yeah.
But that violence will not make that lie true.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, these are human beings. And if Georgia's Bataille was in the room, he'll be like, haven't you seen the economic function of waste? That turning something into waste has never meant that it has then completely been deranged of use. Waste can still be used.
Yeah.
I mean, this is revolutionary, so to speak, if you think in those terms. But for us and Achille in particular, it's to precisely rescue the fact that even the ultimate violence of the Holocaust, even the ultimate violence of a genocide, so to speak, as Tio Soga says, couldn't extinguish
the Jews.
It could extinguish you.
Yeah. No, so let us look at the trajectory of post-colonial African states so that we would be able to then explain exactly what you're asking as to where is, or why haven't we produced, this public servant, this revolution.
Yeah, maybe we can do the Sahel at this moment. Take me through the Sahel on the back of this question. Let's leave these ones who are providing transport to children. Yeah. Let's do West Africa. Maybe it's a bit better,
Yeah. So if we abandon completely that question,
we don't abandon it. We carry it with us and say,
what has happened?
What has happened to West Africa? It's older than us.
Yeah.
The decolonization has been in West Africa longer than it has been in South Africa from a point of view of Africans who are now running their affairs and all of that. They've been running there. I don't know whether they are running those affairs. But if you were to say the status of decolonization in West Africa with the recent coups, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso,
So let me start here, Busene, which is that unfortunately we meet at this time when, as the continent, we're in a very desperate situation. Desperate in a sense that, unlike the decades before, say, 1990, unlike before, post-1990, as Africans, we've been confronted by political, social, and economic problems, not only at a practical level, but even the tools with which to make sense of those problems we do not have. Now, let me try and make obvious what I'm suggesting. Immediately after independence, or in the era post-independence, African scholars, were confronted with, the first generation of African scholars was confronted with the question as to what kind of social science, are we going to enact as African scholars? And their answer was simple. African social scientific thought would have to be responsive and relevant. Now, what did that lead to? It is that if you watch closely the evolution of politics in Africa from the 1960s up until maybe mid-1990s, there is a parallel movement of political developments with scholarship that makes sense of those political developments. Now, again, to explicate this, let's work in reverse. By the 1990s, late 80s, 1990s, Africa was basically at the throes of structural adjustment programs imposed by the IMF and the World Bank. If you look at African social scientific thought, it was concerned with structural adjustment and proposed alternatives to structural adjustment. There were all sorts of alternatives to structural adjustment. Move, back from the late 80s to early 90s to, the late 60s, early 70s. There's a dominance of coups, in West Africa, which we'll get into in a moment. If you look at Nigeria, for instance, since independence in 1960, other than the first president, post the Civil War in Nigeria, the next president is a military head of state, Yakubu Gowon, followed by Shagari, followed by Buhari, followed by, Obasanjo, followed by Babangida, followed by Abacha. Only after Abacha, when Obasanjo returns. Now, as you have
all military
heads of state
with coups, yes,
coming into power via coups, as that was happening in Nigeria, the same thing was happening in Ghana. The longest serving of the Ghanaian military heads of states is, Flight Lieutenant Jerry Rawlings. If you look at African scholarship at that time, there is a parallel bourgeoising of scholarship on civil-military relations. Scholars like Ebo H. Full, Ghanaian scholar, Bayo Adekanyo, a Nigerian scholar. These were the leading lines. So the point I'm driving at is that in as much as the continent we've been confronted with problems, political, economic, and, social problems, scholarship has not been too far off, to offer the handles with which to make sense of the problems that we were confronted with. African scholarship has always been relevant and responsive, to the political problems that. And there were organizations that had been set up, within the continent by African scholars, precisely to ensure that our scholarly agenda as Africans was not externally determined. Rhodesia was one of them, and there were several others, SAPES in Zimbabwe, and several others. What this enabled us as Africans was that we observed a problem in society, and then we threw scholarship or scholarly resources at it. Let us study this phenomenon so that we may make sense of it. So if we were still in that era, the people we are talking about, we would have identified it at an intellectual level and said how it is that people who struggled for 100 years to liberate, black people suddenly turn into criminals and point the guns at the very people that they wanted to liberate. Now we would have thrown intellectual resources into it and made sense of it. But what has happened in Africa from the late 90s onwards is that African scholarship has become an eclectic, basically. It is now you follow whatever brings more money, and
or whatever takes you to professorship quicker.
You follow that route. So there's our scholarship has,
but there's too much as well, like a sense of escaping the world. People are talking about being I don't know the word, but being free, like being free from
you're very correct,
from everything, ultimately from responsibility. If the proposition has always been we want to be responsible for ourselves,
yes.
So
that scholarship
and go to the cryptic.
Yes. You see, that scholarship that was responsive and relevant and responsible, you've added the third element, which was actually the definition African scholars gave to African social scientific thought. There's been a disintegration of that collective, identity of African scholars who are concerned with making sense from an African perspective, not patronizing the African perspective, from a real African perspective. The problems with which we...
So what would be, what you're telling us is that this Sahel moment of Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso shouldn't be understood as new.
You are very correct.
It is part of what often occurs in... So is that what you're saying? What often occurs in West Africa?
So if we understand... let me get to this point in answering you via a different way. One of the tragedies we suffered as South Africa is that post-1994, we are basically the last country, 1994, we are the last country to gain independence. Or well, maybe now you would what's that country that gained independence from Morocco?
Western Sahara hasn't,
yes. But we are the last country to gain independence. So we had the benefit of
the
insight.
Yes.
We could basically look at the rest of the continent and see where it went wrong. Now, what we suffered was the continued domination of South African social scientific thought by white scholars who refused the comparison of South Africa with the rest of the continent. If you even look at the scholarship on democratization in South Africa in the 90s, it compared South Africa to Latin America, South Africa to Eastern Europe. So what happened in South Africa could not be compared to the rest of the continent in 1960 because the terms of the debate would have been, this is the moment of independence. What is a sine qua non, for independence? What do countries do when they become independent? So white scholars precluded the possibility of using the rest of the continent as the mirror with which to look at South Africa's reality in 1994.
But this is the same with the Bajuing recent decolonial studies. They are not taking us to the continent, are they?
No, they are not, unfortunately.
They will not be able to traverse with us the different regions, the different phenomenon, but they will not impose this comparability, which Mamdani actually makes in Citizen and Subject, this sort of South African exceptionalism.
He complains bitterly.
Somehow something exceptional happened here. Yes, indeed. Okay, proceed. But
so I'm going to West Africa. Yeah. I'm saying that if we had benefited ourselves from that vantage point we were at and looked at the rest of the continent, as the mirror, with which to understand us, our analysis of not just South African problems, but of the rest of the continent would have been very rich. So one of the limitations of South African scholarship today is that it has refused to take the African experience seriously. Now let's return to West Africa to explicate that refusal to take the African experience seriously. today everyone talks about, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso and the military coups that have happened in that area, as if, or let's put it this way, the explanations are very presentist. People are looking for explanations in the present. If you look at the history of West African politics post-independence, you would see that throughout West Africa, one of the distinguishing markers of politics in West Africa post-independence has been the prevalence of military coups in West Africa. Now, in scholarship, there were many explanations for this. In fact, some of the scholarship encouraged these coups, in West Africa. We've exemplified with Nigeria, we've exemplified with Ghana. Burkina Faso itself is not new to, Sankara had come to power via, so we have several experiences of military coups. And if you look at not just these countries, several other countries, they've had these coups. What was the scholarship? What was the historical explanations? Why was there a prevalence of military coups in West Africa? In early comparative politics, there were a number of theories that were proposed by American scholars especially. One of the theories was the theory of a Praetorian state. Now, what was
Praetorian state? Yes.
What was the theory of a Praetorian state? You know it.
The good soldier.
Yeah. Yes. And not only, maybe for the viewers, we must explain it.
Yes, please do.
So basically, the theory of a Praetorian state, which comes out of early comparative politics, particularly in America, says that African societies or newly independent societies have not established a strong enough, political machinery to cope with the pressures of the demands and, agitations that...
But mostly to resist immediate dependency. They don't have enough machinery to resist post-independence the tendency to quickly look back to the master for tutelage. So if you're going to continue that independence in the development of society, you're going to need the military.
Yeah.
Okay, please explain. I'm remembering now, yeah. But you explain it. I think you have a very good unfolding of it, yeah.
So the theory of the Praetorian state, basically, as I've said, there's a worry in the West to come closer to. There's a worry in the West, and then sometimes the worry is self-manufactured in the West, basically, which is that these societies are not strong enough. They would not be able to withstand the pressures of political agitation and, the demands that the citizens are going to make for rights and all of those things, and that might lead to collapse. In order to, preclude the possibility of collapse, let us narrow the political space, in these societies. And so a Praetorian state is a very small but strong state, that does not, allow for all liberties, protest and everything, but it is focused on developing societies. So the trade-off is that, we give you development, quote and unquote, we deny you rights and other things, crudely put. And the military is considered to be the best avenue, to actualize this theory of a Praetorian state. And so the support by the Western world of military coups and the tolerance, because the support was not always, people say, but there was no, direct support. It was the tolerance that the West showed to some of these military coups, justifying them sometimes, or post the coup not saying anything and allowing those military coups. I mean, we now know from evidence emerging that actually Ivory Coast, had to approach France, in order to support the coup against the Burkinabe, Thomas Sankara. So the West did not support it directly, but, sometimes it gave window guidance. So that was the first theory that, came out of comparative politics, early comparative politics. The second theory that came out of comparative politics was the theory of a modernizing soldier. Remember, modernization theory had said that, Africa was at the throes of modernization. And the theory of a modernizing soldier basically said that if you want these societies to develop fast, it is best because the military, is always, and when you say the military, all the facets, the Navy, the Air Force, and the military, because they depend on up-to-date technological advancements. The supposition was that if you have the military in power, this drive for being technologically advanced and being up-to-date will decimate, or rather will, flow down to society. And soldiers were assumed to be, or the military rule was assumed to be the best vehicle for modernization. And so
but both somehow depend on the military, both theories.
Both theories depend on the military. So, because we're trying to explain the predominance of military coups in West Africa, and in that history of, West African politics. And of course, Nigeria being the dominant power in West Africa since independence, what it meant is that, even with the coming into existence of ECOWAS, which is their equivalent of SADC, with the coming into existence of ECOWAS, the idea of the military being out of power could not be at the center of West African, regional agenda, because the dominant power itself
are soldiers.
Are soldiers. So the politics of
commander.
Yes, commander
of commanders.
Yeah,
everybody, you turn left, right, and center. It's just been collected as a commander. The person you are paying
taxes to
is a
commander.
Yeah.
So, and even vice chancellor, by the way,
commanders, but worse, the traffic warden. The guy who's controlling
has a military out.
Is a commander.
He commands the traffic
with corp. Is a commander.
Yeah. But there was a generalization of that culture. When I went to Ibadan University in Nigeria, prior to my arriving, there had been a time when there were military, vice chancellors in Nigeria.
Why doesn't it work? I mean, this is... I know I'm pushing you.
Yeah.
It's the umpteenth attempt. Traore's the umpteenth attempt. And it seems to me that there's always very justified conditions, or very justified reasons. France must get out. This chap is collaborating with France, or this delivery, that delivery. Sometimes they are wrong. They are not justified because they are taking out a progressive leader who is against actually a Sankara and all of that. But you seem to be saying the military has been busy in the
West African
region of the world, and I want to then push you to theoretically that's what the expectation is. Why hasn't the military despot, the modernizing soldier, gotten it right? From us here, we're obsessed with elections.
Yeah.
South Africans have been doing elections as a form of politics for the whole of 20th century.
Yeah.
Where Africans were, as a political form, they were always electing each other in the unions. Actually the Eastern Cape, or the Cape, was delayed to come to the Congress movement because they had hopes of franchise.
Yeah.
Until it was taken away in the 30s. They were less participating in the African National Congress and national politics. But in a sense, when you look at that, suddenly today there are people who think maybe that's the option.
The military.
A modernizing soldier.
Yeah. So let's first start here. In order to have a military government, you need a political culture that is, let's not say receptive, that can reproduce military rule. I think this is where some people miss it when they, think that it is every society that can have a military coup.
No, leave South Africa.
No, I'm not making that point.
Yeah, I don't care at this stage. But you are noting 50 years
Yeah.
or more
So there's a political culture
that
in
was
West
not
Africa.
collaborating with these military establishments in West Africa?
No, I'm saying because of this extended experience in West Africa of military rule, there has developed in West Africa a political culture. People know how to respond
I see.
when a military regime mounts, the stage and hit the brass band and makes the announcement, borders are closed, and all of that. Nigerians know what to do at that point.
But why hasn't it worked, this
Yeah.
form to sort of do the upliftment of the living
society.
conditions? Yes.
So now the theory of a modernizing soldier was in part, unfortunately, mired in the Cold War. Comparative politics as it emerges in America. Remember, comparative politics starts, in America, and the intent is, or the driving intent is that America post the Second World War realizes that if it's going to compete with the Soviet Union for spheres of influence, it needed to have a foothold in these places, these, societies. But, for Europe, it had had colonies. For the Soviet Union, it had supported liberation movements, so it had an entry point. America had no entry point into these societies. Now, its entry point was comparative politics. So in 1953, the American, Social Science Research Council establishes a committee for comparative politics headed by James Smoot Coleman. And its purpose was basically to study African societies and this is what became area studies, in order that America's extension of its influence would be based on knowledge or understanding of these societies. So this was not an honest theory. What I'm driving at is that these theories, either the theory of a modernizing soldier or the Praetorian state, these were not honest theories, They were part of the Cold War, so that America, because it had studied these societies, its entry point was through knowledge of these societies, and then began to develop models, for these societies. In fact, if we were to move a bit away from these two theories, a good example of what comparative politics at that time was doing is a book by W.W. Rostow, Stages of Growth.
Yes.
A non-communist manifesto. That's the full title of the book.
Yes.
So the intent was to develop via knowledge or to extend influence via knowledge into these societies. Many of the militaries in these societies were really nothing to write home about, remember.
They were not fully developed.
They were not fully developed missionaries. What would mean is that it would open them up to American support. We can support you, we can develop your military. Since it is, what is going to drive your development, let's have military pacts, cooperation, development, and we can train your military and whatnot. It had found an entry point, into influencing the politics of these societies, which it didn't have because it didn't have colonies. And unlike the Soviet, it had not supported liberation movements. So the theories don't succeed in part because they were not honest. These were not benevolent soldiers. These were not, real soldiers committed to their countries. These were politicians in military uniform, basically. The only difference between them and the politicians, the comprador, if we were to take Fanon, was simply that these ones were in military uniform, and enjoyed the support of the West. They were in military uniform, but also enjoyed the support of the West and had an extra, resource, which is coercive machinery in order to dominate society. So it was bound never to succeed. But I'm not sure. I don't participate in the theory of development. In order to be genuine, it has to be participatory. I mean, other people would make that argument. I don't think that, there's any causal relation between participation and development. We've seen societies that are less participatory developing,
But I mean, in the end, the truth is, I think that's a bastardization, as it were, because the ontology of authority is nonetheless, anybody who's going to think that authority by its nature is going to survive without legitimacy is that there are different forms of legitimization. And even in Western societies, they get very little because bureaucratization is another form.
Look at the level of election, because that's the only real participation.
Exactly. I mean, that's the point I'm making here, that to even think that what the West calls democracy is by measures, if the measure is participation, it differs from the Chinese, for instance, where there are no open elections, is almost an argument against degrees, not quite form, because of how bureaucratized. Hence Trump's cry about the deep state, the deep state, the deep state. What he's talking about is that America is not a democracy. But what's wrong in your view with the African despot? Maybe I put it differently. When you look at Traore, and the new benevolent soldier, who has emerged, as well as his other soldiers, his programs up to this point, what is the idea? You think this will be a different outcome from the upliftment of the living conditions of people?
So the answer is yes and no.
So the answer is literally a non-answer.
No. You see, in a dialectic,
I'm kidding. Yeah.
in a dialectic, the negative and the positive can coexist.
Okay.
No, here's my point. I do think that, at least from our ability to read human intention, as far as we can go in reading human intention, there's no doubt that there is good intent.
Yes.
We can't doubt the commitment.
Hence we call them benevolent.
Yes. We can't doubt the good intentions. That good intentions and human actions have to occur within the objective material conditions. And I think that there is a structure. There is a structure that constitutes those objective material conditions that is going to make it very difficult to break out, which is not to say that the experiment must not then go on. No, not at all. There is a structure of the regional economy, of the African economy, the international economy, that is going to, at a certain point, begin to squeeze these projects, and not that they are naive, they don't know. I mean, they've demonstrated, very well that they understand this. I think that this movement cannot, unfortunately, be a movement of one or two African states. That's why I say the answer is yes and no. It is that in order for it to have sufficient armor and room to resist these structural pressures that are going to come in, closing on them, it needed to be at least a regional movement. If the whole of West Africa, for instance, was on board, it would be able to resist. All of the countries are landlocked. But there are several other limitations. They all depend on importation of oil. So at a point, those things are going to begin to make themselves felt, because, you don't have a sufficient armor, to push back. It needed to be a regional or an African project. Now, I do not think they have to wait. I mean, we have seen how, at least at an ideological level, they have shamed the conservative Nigerian government, for instance, and that is part of the project of, conscientization, and so they've done us a huge favor. of saying that, no, actually, you have not been thinking about this. And this is reflective, by the way, of the death of ideologically and relevant African scholarship. Because suddenly, you were not able to make sense like we did in the 1960s, make an analysis of the two groups, towards the formation of the OAU, the Casablanca. Now, in this instance, you see the analysis between, the conflict, or rather the interaction between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Nigeria, ECOWAS. It's void of ideological, analysis.
Yeah, but I thought there was decolonization studies. This is my point originally. My original point is, after like all these huge ruptures in the continent happen at the back of at least a decade of people saying they are busy with decolonization studies. Suddenly, there is no help.
They were busy.
What are the scholars saying about Tanzania?
They were busy. They were being promoted.
No, I think they rejected. We can call it whatever. They rejected the discipline of science. In a sense that when I think of great scholars, for instance, great intellectuals in the continent, they don't have the discipline of Ali Mazrui. They don't have the discipline of, let's not even go as far back as Ali Mazrui. They don't have the discipline of Mahmoud Mamdani. What really happens most of the time is a festival of peripheralism.
Look, I agree with you, but where I disagree with you, I mean, the rush to say that, how do you put it? You say that there was a refusal of science or something.
So you don't like the term science, but to do knowledge, Lwazi, go Venezuelans say, come and interact with us.
Yeah.
What do you do? Like a good you said student of society. You read what their institutions are about. You listen to them, you listen to their debates. You get embroiled in their lived experience in order to come up with a perspective of some sort, which you then engage with and against them. You do what discourse what living in any way should be.
Yeah.
But that discipline to study, to say, I actually, as I speak now, don't understand this phenomenon. In order to understand it, I must go and have it say what it is and look at its many parts and so on and so forth. I mean, that's social science. But ideologically, that's where we have to draw a propelling of the hard sciences, a propelling of the engineers, a propelling of the quantum physics and all those chaps that normally don't think about the ideological proposition. We have to, by now we could have already sourced decolonization, in quantum mechanics, in artificial intelligence and all of that. My point is, at the point at which there's bourgeoising of decolonization study,
we are
Mali happens, Burkina Faso happens,
Niger
happens, Madagascar happens in the most recent years. There are huge protests in Kenya, in Tanzania, huge protests in Mozambique. You know what I mean? And
then the scholarship is nowhere to be found.
Where is it? It's somewhere, but not there. It is somewhere. It is. That was what I wanted to ask you. Where is it if not making knowledge about and for the continent? Which I'm saying is science, whatever the point there. My contestations are not at odds per se.
Yeah.
I'm looking for scholarly
knowledge on these things.
About ourselves.
Yeah. Now we agree, scholarly knowledge, not science.
Somebody would have said, Mali is going to happen. If scholarship about this continent existed, somebody would have already said to us, the chaps of the whites here in South Africa are already saying where we are going to be in 2050. Yeah. But they are not politicians, scholars in different research departments as well as research outfits. They are busy, they get all the time to say 2029, a combination of what was the former liberation grouping will score below 50% of the electorate. Therefore, the following, you know what I mean? They are the decolonization studies. What is it saying, for instance, about the Sudan?
To start with, Mbuyiseni, I mean, if you want a very unfortunate answer, is that in South Africa today, you can't get more than 10 black South Africans who would be able to speak intelligibly about the continent. When I say intelligibly, who would be able to tell you the history of Nigeria, the history of Kenya, the history. It is not their fault. It is the fault of the education system. How do we educate them? Now we lost. We said, I don't think we now can hide the fact the nationalist movement was outmaneuvered by, the white settler colonizers in South Africa. We were completely outmaneuvered, and they retained control over the institutions of socialization and institutions.
The President Mbeki made this concession on this platform when it comes in the main to education, because it's very strange, because they were in the continent.
Yes.
And they were educated, some of them,
by
institutions in the continent, in Lusaka, in Tanzania, in Harare, and Nigeria. They understood the continent.
Very much so. They lived there.
And they knew the continent's implications on us and ours, the South Africa's implications, the continent and all of that. I understand, but I thought this decolonization was this statement you're making, that the recognition of this problem and something having to be made about it. And I'm saying,
I think accept the fact that the people who trade on decolonization are self-centered, self-interested academics.
But only if they're not talking about education, if they're not talking about the continent, what are they doing?
And then we'd have a conversation. Give up on them, then we can have a conversation. There's nothing you're going to get out of those people. They are interested. What's the next opportunity to get out and go somewhere, using this ticket? When is the next round of promotions? They're not interested in building institutions, in building research outfits. They're not interested in having PhD laboratories. I always dreamt that, if the movement had sent us out, to study in the continent, they would, around us, constitute PhD laboratories where I can take students to Nigeria for 6 months and teach them West African politics from West Africa. Take them to East Africa, teach them East African politics in West Africa. Because where then does your cohort of, foreign affairs practitioners come from? Okay. This civil servant you were talking about has to be manufactured in those PhD laboratories, that we ought to have had. We were completely outmaneuvered. The movement itself considered us its enemies. At a point, we were not wanted, by the movement. Somehow, we had some scurvy or leprosy, within the movement. And the result is that the institutions of mass culture and institutions of socializations, perpetuate a certain kind of knowledge that is turned away from us as black people, and the continent. The result is that we aren't able to go back, for instance, to West Africa and make sense of the developments in West Africa such that, remember, you explain, you predict, you control. We couldn't predict because we hadn't even begun the task of understanding in order to explain.
All right.
Yeah. Lushaba.
Thank you, my brother.